All right, there we are. We are live. So welcome everyone to CODEPINK's weekly WTF is going on in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm super pleased to have with us today a good friend, Yesenia Portillo from CISPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And we're going to talk about all things El Salvador today within the 30, 40 minutes we've got. Welcome to the show, Yesenia.
Hi everyone. Hi Leo. Thank you for having me.
So let's start off with coronavirus in El Salvador. The country took some of the strictest measures to prevent mass infections of COVID-19, but unlike other countries in the region that took similar actions, there wasn't really an emphasis on helping out the poor and working class with the economic impacts of the epidemic. So how has the pandemic and the government's response affected El Salvador's poor and working class people?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, El Salvador has taken kind of some of the most strict measures around COVID since the very beginning. So there's been a very, very strict quarantine. They've forcibly detained over 14,000 Salvadorans now at this point. There's still 2,000 people that are continue to be detained. All of those folks who are still being detained, most, if not all, have been held arbitrarily. So many of these detentions have gone on for over 30 days. And there's just been some really, really alarming stories coming out from the quarantine centers. They've been completely unsanitary. There's been a lot of actual spread that has occurred because of the way that the quarantine centers were set up. And I just was reading a Human Rights Watch report about that El Salvador is one of the worst countries when it comes also to access to information during the pandemic. And a lot of this is information related to people's health. So people in quarantine centers are not receiving, for example, the results of their tests, and even if there's been stories of people taking multiple tests, up to 5 tests, and still not being released. So yeah, there's been an opacity around the public's access to information when it relates to public health and safety, but also around government spending. And then the question specifically about how this has impacted, the country's most oppressed populations, working class people, impoverished communities. Originally he was celebrated for announcing this $300 payment and that rents and bills were going to be cut. And so he was kind of celebrated by international celebrities and in the mainstream press. So he really made it seem in his rhetoric like he was going to take care of people. But at this point, people have gone almost 3 months without being able to feed themselves. And there was some $300 payments that were dispersed, but that money did not get to a vast majority of people who actually needed it. And so, even if they did get it, $300 for 3 months to feed a family is just not gonna cut it, in a country where so many people work in the informal sector, they live day to day. And so whatever money they make in the market selling that day is what's gonna feed them that same day. So it's been a really, really difficult situation, a lot of desperation. And then some of the people that also didn't get the funds, because the way that it was supposed to work is that employers were supposed to pay their employees even if they weren't working. But there's been many, many, many reports. And then, they kind of changed that afterwards, that empresas could fire, that employers could fire or let go of employees if they couldn't afford to keep them anymore. So, there's been tens of thousands of people that have lost their jobs. People in the maquila sector have been organizing because they haven't been getting paid at all from their employers. And so they don't have a way to feed themselves. And so we've seen reports reports of people, more and more people kind of asking for aid urgently with the banderas blancas, or the white flags. Yeah, and then also, of course, the people who have been also mostly impacted, or more specifically or particularly impacted as well, have been women, the LGBT community, trans women particularly as well, because Nayib Bukele generally, but also specifically during the coronavirus crisis, doesn't have a politic that centers the needs of the most marginalized communities. And in El Salvador, femicide is a huge issue. Violence against trans women and trans people is a huge issue that this government has completely ignored, acts like it's not happening, you know? And so that's kind of the same way that he's responded during the coronavirus crisis. There hasn't been any acknowledgement of the ways in which domestic violence has increased during the pandemic, because people are not able to go to work. And so, like, for example, a lot of people in the trans community, they're not able to go to work. And so then they are, you know, in their homes where they're not accepted, and their only value is what they can bring into their household. And if they're not working anymore, then the violence against them increases tenfold, you know. There's been 26 femicides in the country since the pandemic, and hasn't said anything about it. Yeah, and then also the long-term effects on the long-term economic effects are also going to be like drastically impacting the poor and the working poor in El Salvador, particularly with the international debt that he has kind of signed up the next generations of Salvadorans for. He's been approved to seek out $3 billion in loans, and that money is like hugely marked to go towards business, whether it's, you know, big corporations, private government contractors. Also, there is an emphasis on like small and medium businesses as well. But what we have seen already of the loans that they have been able to acquire, one in particular, the IMF loan, which is $349 million, the payback conditions of that is all austerity, you know, so all of it is going to be money that the general Salvadoran population will have to pay back through a general tax, through cuts to social spending, increased taxes on gas and electricity, for example. That's what the IMF and the Salvadoran government agreed to with the one loan that we already know about. So yeah, it's going to, in the long term, also continue to affect impoverished communities more than anything.
I'm glad you brought up austerity, because really we're seeing that throughout the hemisphere, where we had the neoliberal countries are doing really poorly in terms of handling the pandemic. And other countries that maybe are starting to become more neoliberal, as you know, Bukele has only been in power for about a year and a half now, a year. And so it's the pandemic is being used as an excuse to impose even more austerity in other places. But switching gears a little bit, about 2 months ago, we saw images of Salvadoran prisoners packed together in inhumane conditions. For those of you who saw the promotion for this webinar, there was a cartoon of it. And so this was a PR stunt kind of aimed at showing how President Bukele was tough on crime. But here in the US, it seems to have backfired, and even outlets like the New York Times are starting to call Bukele authoritarian. How are those pictures received in El Salvador?
Yeah, so in El Salvador, there's not this mainstream or widespread backlash against the human rights abuses against prisoners that you mentioned, particularly that are kind of shown in these photos that the government's own press secretary took. And I asked you to change the photo on the flyer, because what that photo really does, and what these photos really do, is have, you know, these heavily armed, they look like stormtroopers, you know, policemen hovering over people that have hands behind their back, unarmed, almost naked, you know, and they're just like completely dehumanizing images that still, what they suggest is that they're still so threatening, just their existence, you know, their existence, like they're harmless because they pose no risk, they're naked almost, you know, and handcuffed, but still we need stormtrooper level protection against just their mere existence. And I think there's like a very small step from that to they shouldn't exist at all. And so I think that's like the kind of purpose of those images, is to really justify us, like their slow death or their eventual death. And so yeah, those images, I'm just like, please, let's not use them. And instead there's this cartoon where it kind of centers him as somebody who's just like causing such inhumanity. But you know, what those images were about and what that moment was about, it was happening during the pandemic, but it's something that would have potentially been going on regardless, because it has to do with an issue that, you know, the Salvadoran government has been supposedly trying to address for a long time, which is, you know, increase. So at that time, there was an increased report in homicides. And I say increased homicides reported because the homicide rate is not something that I think is something we can just like take for granted. But I think, you know, there's a way that it gets reported, you know, and so there was an increase in homicides that were being reported at that time. And so he announced a maximum lockdown in the prisons because he said that the homicides were being, you know, called, the shots for those were being called from inside the prisons. And, you know, they locked up the cells with like cardboard so people couldn't see outside. Yeah, just like really dangerous conditions under a pandemic. The prisons are already, you know, super unsanitary. There's always like outbreaks, and there's always been concerns about the conditions in prisons in El Salvador. So this only makes it worse. He also claimed to authorize lethal force via Twitter in the streets. And he said that anybody who is calling attention to these human rights abuses is an accomplice, you know, and that they just want Salvadorans to die, which is similar to the way that he responded to the coronavirus pandemic and concerns around human rights abuses around his response to coronavirus. He said, anybody who questions the way I'm dealing with this just wants Salvadorans to die. And shortly after he authorized, supposedly, because he can't authorize anything via Twitter, you know, but that's what he does. He claims to be doing things on Twitter. He says, I authorize this or that. I tell such and such ministry to go do that, this and that, you know. So he supposedly authorized the police to kill people if they pose a threat. Just a few days after that, on Mother's Day, on May 10th, there was a killing of a woman, Zulma Yamilet Valencia Cisco, and the police claimed that she was a gang member, and this, of course, is completely denied by her community. And so it's been kind of denounced from feminists as one of the many femicides that have happened. And yeah, there are some organizations in El Salvador that denounce these measures, like some bigger NGOs like Cristo Sal, and then also like some other kinds of more grassroots organizations like Los Siempre Sospechosos de Todo is a big is an organization that has been very loud about this even before Naive, or about mano dura policies and the criminalization of youth. And so, and also like communities that bear the brunt of these policies are also opposed, you know, people who are affected by police abuse and like the criminalization of their conditions are also, and of course, there is a racial hierarchy in El Salvador. And so, you know, Afro-descendant and indigenous communities are like disproportionately impacted. And there are studies that show that lighter skinned mestizos have less of, you know, they're more likely to kind of cheer on mano dura policies, and that and there was an article about this by Nalia Rodriguez, who's doing this research in Latino rebels. So yeah, there's that, and also, you know, the militarization of the Legislative Assembly that happened on February 9th was also about this. It was about mano dura policies and more money towards police and military, you know, and the first announcements against these things came from feminist and LGBT collectives, you know, that they were saying an increase in military and security funding is gonna more directly and disproportionately impact, you know, indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, impoverished communities, and women and LGBT communities are the ones that are most affected by police brutality and violence. So even though on a whole, like as a mainstream, we don't see as much backlash from Salvadorans, there is pushback, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the murder of this woman you mentioned really reminds me of the false positives that we see and used to see, but also continue to see in Colombia, where, you know, basically peasants and poor people were killed by the army and then dressed up as to be look like guerrillas, right? So here, of course, it's not guerrillas, but it's gangs. And since we're in the US, I think, you know, as you well know, that we should mention that where these gangs originated was in the US, particularly MS-13, which had been demonized quite a bit by the Trump administration. I think they've been somewhat quiet about MS-13 lately.
Yeah.
I'm also glad you mentioned the militarization of the legislature, because that leads me into my next question. You know, you mentioned, you know, social movements and organizations in El Salvador that have been denouncing, you know, the threats to the rule of law and the attacks on the country's democratic institutions, and also outside of El Salvador, international organizations and even the actors like the UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet have all warned that Bukele is kind of, you know, is attacking and trying to subvert the country's democracy. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, what happened in the legislature, the militarization, and other examples of how Bukele is kind of undermining the checks and balances in the country?
Yeah, so definitely the alarm was raised early on by progressive social movements in El Salvador about Nayib Bukele's intention to attack and undermine the separation of powers and the other branches of government. So when he first came to office, he said that nothing would stand between God and his people to change El Salvador. So since that time, that was something that social movements said, what he means is that he's going to be attacking the other branches of government. And they were right, you know, which we saw on February 9th. And, you know, that entire thing was kind of you know, just like a berrinche, I don't know how to say that in English, but a berrinche, and just like a fight, a silly fight that he was silly and dangerous fight that he was waging against the Legislative Assembly in order to justify even more money to military and security, which his budget already increased military and security so much and had decreased social spending in really important areas of the government. For example, like the Ministry of the Environment and the National Water Agency also, and just countless others that didn't see either necessary increases or saw cuts, you know? So yeah, and I mean, that was one thing, and his whole kind of presentation to the Salvadoran people about this was that he really needed this money in order to fight the gangs, and that if he didn't get this money, and that the Legislative Assembly wasn't wanting to give him the money because they don't care about the Salvadoran people, you know? And so therefore he claimed to have the backing of the Salvadoran people when he entered the military, when he entered the Legislative Assembly. And then he changed his tune for a little bit and said that the reason why he brought the military to the Legislative Assembly was to defend the legislators from the people that wanted their heads, basically. So it's just like a lot of rhetoric, but going into COVID-19, it has definitely like taken that same route, you know? He's just continued that same tactic of saying that only he cares about the Salvadoran people, and that any critique or kind of like anything that like the democratic institutions of the government that are meant to provide some checks and balances, that they're just getting in the way, you know, because he has all the solutions and they're getting in the way. And so we see this also throughout COVID, you know. I don't know if you have questions about that or if I should just keep going.
No, well, keep going. But before you do, we got a comment on YouTube asking or suggesting that we explain what mano dura means. It basically means a crackdown on crime, heavy-handed, a kind of iron fist crackdown.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's something that predates Naive, and it is the response of you know, and it's like a U.S. backed response. It's something that the U.S. Embassy, you know, when they give military and security funding to you know, under the Alliance for Prosperity, for example, they give hundreds of millions of dollars to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras also to supposedly address the issues of violence and insecurity. But all of the money goes to punitive responses. And what that translates into in El Salvador, in the context of El Salvador, is mano dura, which just means like tough on crime, basically. And yeah, like there is a disinvestment in the kinds of programs that will actually give youth an opportunity to have a dignified life. And they're, you know, so it says the problem are these evil people, and it doesn't locate the real root cause, which is neoliberal policies that are causing mass inequality and mass poverty.
So despite everything that Nayib Bukele has been doing, it's very kind of worrisome that he still has high approval ratings, no? So what explains the support he has?
Yeah, so, you know, he's a populist, you know, and I can kind of also just go back a little bit into his attacks against the other branches of government during the COVID-19 crisis. But like these things go together, you know, his populism and his ability to, or I don't know if he's been able to, but his attempts to undermine the other branches of government depend on his ability to manipulate the population into believing that only he has the answers. And so yeah, they go hand in hand. His entire strategy rests on, like I said, being able to manipulate the populace into blindly supporting him so that he can use it as a weapon against their own interests, you know? So to the degree that we, you know, trust the institutions of Salvadoran democracy, which, you know, are also have their own problems and issues, you know, like the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly is majority right wing. It's actually, they have a super majority actually, you know, and the Salvadoran Supreme Court, the magistrates are elected by the Legislative Assembly. So, you know, right-wing corporate elite interests have a huge sway in both of those branches of government, which isn't to say that, you know, Naib's attacks against them aren't very dangerous still, you know, I mean, so yeah, I mean, during the coronavirus pandemic, you know, the Legislative Assembly at the end of March kind of gave him these broad powers to spend government executive funds without going through a more like, you know, detailed process of approval for that spending, as long as he then provided, you know, well-documented reporting on how he ended up spending it, which he hasn't done, you know. And so because he didn't adequately provide accounting of his spending, the Legislative Assembly has been trying to kind of take that power back, but he overrides all of that through executive decrees. So they've been going through, like, they've been in a back and forth about this. And he claims, you know, again, this populism element, he claims that the reason why the legislature doesn't want to give him, or doesn't want to allow or declare a state of emergency. Can you hear me? We're frozen.
I'm frozen? No, I can hear you.
Okay. That, you know, the reason why they don't want to allow a state of emergency is because they just want Salvadorans to die. And he says that about the Supreme Court too, you know, so the Supreme Court has been trying to, has been ruling that these arbitrary detentions are illegal and that he needs to let people go and that he needs to stop arbitrarily detaining people. And he says that, you know, that the Supreme Court just wants people to die. And it's really bizarre. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, he wants to maintain, like, he wants to, I don't know what he wants. I mean, I do know what he wants, but, you know, what he's doing is inflicting shock and terror on the population, you know, and saying, I need to keep you under this threat of detention because y'all don't listen and you can die, you know. And so, but, you know, and that's causing them to starve because he's not giving them food, you know. And yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, and a lot of it rests on this desire to spend money without being accountable to where those funds are going, which is something that I mentioned earlier. The Human Rights Watch put out a pretty good summary of everything that's been happening and how it's been working out. But, you know, his populism is that, why do people love him so much? Because that's how he maintains his power. That's his strategy. He puts a lot of energy into that, you know. And so he comes from a communications and marketing background, and they've also drastically increased the budget around publicity. So they've drastically increased the publicity budget. So they spend enormous amounts of money and resources on, the executive spends enormous amounts of money and resources on its image and propaganda. They also pay trolls. You know, this is like something that's well known. People close to him that work for him have admitted to it. He's done it since his campaign forever, you know. And also there is massive discontent from human rights organizations, you know, across the board. There's, if you follow CISPES, you know, this is not our analysis. This is analysis from human rights progressive organizations that we work with in El Salvador. And that's all we share. You know, we only ever share, you know, what the feminist collectives are saying, what the environmental orgs are saying, what the labor rights organizations are saying. And so they're denouncing him constantly. And also everyday Salvadorans. Just because we're not seeing it, it doesn't, like, just because they're not as visible as his own Twitter accounts and his trolls, that doesn't mean that they're not there, you know. And Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought up CISPES and the work you all do with organizations in El Salvador. Can you talk a little bit more about CISPES' latest actions and how folks in the US can support CISPES and the Salvadoran people?
Yeah. Something that has been like the most visible, I think, that CISPES has been working on for the last, since in 2018, when it really like hit the fan over there around, the Legislative Assembly had kind of gained the right-wing majority in 2018. And so they moved quickly to privatize El Salvador's water, which is, it's a struggle that they've been fighting for at least 14 years now, in terms of trying to get the human right to water to be part of the Constitution, and to have a legal framework that will actually protect the country's scarce water resources. So we've been doing a lot of water accompaniment since the right wing tried to pass a privatizing law that would, it's like El Salvador's water is currently under the hands of like corporations and elite, but because social movements have been trying to change that, they've been trying to make it de jure, so like legalize the privatization that already goes on, so they're in this battle, and they've been trying to push the Legislative Assembly to pass the citizens, they call it like the citizens proposal for a general water law. But because of everything with coronavirus, that stuff has kind of been put on pause. And so our accompaniment for that has been put on pause, but I just want to share, like, that's obviously still a major issue. And the Alliance Against the National Alliance Against the Privatization of Water, they just turned 2 this year, because they were born from that moment where people really took to the streets, because the right wing had a super majority. They could have passed a privatization law, but because people took to the streets like they hadn't in like 10 years, it wasn't politically feasible anymore. They still haven't been able to achieve, the end goal of really securing water for everybody. So there's that, and we'll continue to update and continue to do work on that, but there's not a real action step right now necessarily. But also one of the things that we recently launched on June 1st, which was the anniversary of, like a year since Nayib Bukele came to office, given that there is such like undeniable evidence that he is an authoritarian leader, and is causing, that the human rights abuses are just clear and so clear and so evident. It's an opportune moment to call for the cutting of U.S. military and security aid to El Salvador. So on June 1st, we launched an action alert for that. And so that you can contact your congressional representatives and demand that the U.S. Stop sending military and security aid to El Salvador. And you can find that at cispes.org/cut military aid, just one word. So cispes.org/cut military aid. And then the other thing is that CISPES, we do send funds to folks doing like grassroots mobilizing on the ground, to student organizers, youth organizers, maquila workers, feminist union organizers. And so we have a fund for that as well. So if people wanted to donate to grassroots mobilizing efforts in El Salvador, the link for that is cispes.org/strategic organizing fund ES. Like, of course, all one word, cispes.org strategic organizing fund cispes.org strategic organizing fund ES is the link for that. And then CISPES is a US based organization, and our focus is around US policy towards El Salvador specifically, and so we as CISPES know, I don't know that everybody knows this, but the US Embassy plays a major role in Salvadoran politics, and even before. So everyone knew the previous ambassador, Jean Maines, on a first name basis. Like the mainstream news would report about her and they wouldn't even say US Ambassador Jean Maines. They would just say her name. Everybody knows who she is. She's on the news all the time, you know? And so the Trump administration has appointed a new ambassador. His name is Ron Johnson, and he was, before this, a CIA and a US Southern Command kind of link between the two. I don't know, I can't remember exactly what that's called, but yeah, I mean, that's CISPES's work, is to pay attention to the way that the US enforces or like, imposes its economic models and its economic interests in El Salvador. And so look out for, you know, upcoming campaigns specific to that. But, you know, our work, we've been around for 40 years. It's our 40-year anniversary this year. And I think given just how many Salvadorans there are in the diaspora, how many Salvadorans are looking to learn more about why we're here. You know, CISPES's mobilizing work has really been focused around this, you know, around how to mobilize young Salvadorans and people of color around these issues that are also related to local issues and the attacks on immigrants and the attacks on Black communities. And so if you want to support CISPES generally, head to our website. We also have a place where you can donate to us and our work. We're a grassroots funded organization. We don't get foundation money, we don't get government money. And we really are out here trying to do the work. So yeah.
I'm a CISPES donor, and congratulations on 40 years. That's great. Just one last comment. I think it's really, really interesting that you brought up cutting US military aid, and also brought up what's going on with the anti-racist protests, the anti-Black, the protests going on all over the country in support of Black Lives Matter. Because we've seen, you know, the call to defund the police, and that's been joined with calls to defund the military. But one thing that's kind of missing from that conversation is to cut off military aid to countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, really basically the country to cut off military aid everywhere. Because as you so well described, this is aid that's used to oppress communities in their own countries, right? And it's basically financing the police in other countries, police that operate with even fewer rules that the police have here. So thanks so much, Yesenia. This has been a really fascinating conversation. Hope to have you on again, because of course, everything you said about Bukele, it draws so many parallels, not just to Trump, but also to Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Añez in Bolivia, to Duque in Colombia. There's this whole kind of this set of right-wing neoliberals, kind of neo-fascist leaders who are all communicating and working together and coordinating. And it's really up to us right now, social movements here in the US and in El Salvador and throughout the Americas and the global South, to connect and work together even more to kind of counterbalance everything that they're doing.
Can I also just add?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think this moment, you know, in US history is really remarkable. And you know, we owe so much to Black activists, Black organizers, and that are leading the way and calling for a defunding of the police, and the role, like the justification of policing in the US is really at the crux of the justification of all of these things, you know? And so really, like, kind of one of the things that I think is really important is for us to really center and join this call also of defunding the police, and really centering that, and also centering the need to look at our communities and challenge and fight anti-Blackness, you know, because anti-Blackness is what policing is justified with, you know, in the US. And I think the exportation of those systems to El Salvador, and the fact that they aren't questioned, you know, as a solution to gangs and insecurity and crime and poverty, is because so many of us come here and want to assimilate into this society and what it represents, and what it represents is white supremacy, you know. And so really this moment is really powerful, and it's asking us to really think about these things and really challenge ourselves to center you know, the historic, you know, debt that we have also to Black thinkers, abolitionists, and really center this call to the protection of Black lives, the protection of all Black lives, trans Black, you know, lives. And so yeah, I just wanted to also say that.
And I don't know if you have time, but we got one last question that just came in through YouTube. Please comment on the U.S. role in deporting ICE detainees to El Salvador and other countries and the implications of that. So CODEPINK did an alert about 2 weeks ago urging Congress to stop ICE deportations during the pandemic, and really just to stop ICE in general. So what's going on with regards to ICE deportations to El Salvador right now?
Okay, so let me see if I can find the link real quick. Okay, cool. So another action alert that CISPES has is called, you can find it at cispes.org/defend asylum seekers. And that will take you to an action that, you know, you fill out the form and it contacts your congressional representative as well. And it's a call to end the immoral and illegal safe third country agreements. It's an effort led by NISQUA, the network in solidarity with Guatemala. And so yeah, cispes.org/defend asylum seekers. And I think El Salvador has received, the last number that I remember during COVID, 800 deportees from the US. And we know, I mean, there's like a lot of opacity around these things. I think people know a little bit more about Guatemala for whatever reason, and about the fact that Guatemala has been receiving migrants. And part of it may be because of because Guatemala has been implementing the safe third country agreements there. And so what the safe third country agreements are basically like part of Trump's war against asylum seekers. And so El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras agreed to take in basically anybody. Guatemala's agreement was called the Safe Third Country Agreement because people were going through Guatemala, but people are not necessarily going through El Salvador and Honduras. And also these safe third country agreements were not legal anyways under international law. So they stopped calling them that. And like basically like the Salvadoran agreement with the US allows for anybody to get sent there. You know, there's like almost no limitations. And right before the coronavirus kind of pandemic really hit the way that it's hit, you know, I think it was like March, just at the beginning of March, just a few days, Nayib Bukele was in Miami meeting with the Trump administration to finalize plans for how they were going to take in US asylum applicants. And so, yeah, I mean, now we know that people are just stuck in limbo in Mexico because of the coronavirus pandemic. Supposedly, you know, the Trump administration has closed the borders, but these asylum agreements are still kind of vigentes, and they pose a really, really dangerous threat to migrants, particularly Black migrants, particular migrants from Africa, the Caribbean, and, you know, other Central American countries. And, you know, when they were signed, there was a crisis in Tapachula where migrants weren't being allowed to cross through Mexico, and the ones that were being the most impacted were African migrants. And, you know, so there is kind of this concern about who's going to be sent to Honduras and Guatemala to Honduras and El Salvador under these asylum agreements. And what's going to happen to them, because El Salvador is obviously not going to be safe for them. And yeah, so that's kind of where we're at with that, where things are at with that. I don't know, did I answer the question?
I think you did.
Oh, also, El Salvador, the Trump administration, well, the US, and this is probably something that was probably underway before Trump, but they have, the Nayib administration has set up border patrol, US paid for, like US sponsored border patrol in El Salvador, which it's never had before. And, you know, there's a C4 agreement between El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua that people are allowed to transit without having to get visas or anything like that amongst the 4 countries. And so this is like a complete attack on El Salvador's sovereignty, and basically Nayib Bukele just signing on to Trump's war on migrants is what it all boils down to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been the WTF CODEPINK Latin America team's WTF weekly webinar with my guest Yesenia Portillo from CISPES. Thanks for watching, and thanks for being on, Yesenia. Talk soon.
Thank you.